Gary Lineker is in trouble today, and the BBC is having a whale of a time because it gives them an opportunity to quote what Gary Lineker has said and therefore criticise the government at the same time. I think Gary Lineker is absolutely right, on the one hand. Even if Jonathan Agnew tells him to keep his political views to himself. I don't think it's possible to keep your political views to yourself. That is the nature of politics. It's a holistic thing. What we present, how we present ourselves to society and in society is itself a political statement. So the censorship of the BBC requires or is a censorship of a degree of expression. Simply one aspect of our expression of our political natures. We are political animals. We live in society. And so Lineker's idea that the British plans, the government's plans for asylum, isn't it interesting how the word today is asylum, whereas the word in the past was refugee? We have switched the bias from the idea that somebody is fleeing from persecution to somebody is begging for asylum. Many asylum seekers that I've spoken to say that in that process of begging, they feel like beggars. Often very proud people with a great tradition of their own, and they come to us and they're told they've got to speak English, they've got to have exams in English, they've got to conform to our codes of practice and so on. And this is not quite the issue. The issue is that they are seeking refuge. They are seeking asylum. They are forced to flee from a hostile environment, however that is defined. Well, I think Lineker is wrong, because the assumption on which Lineker is writing is that Britain has fallen into a sort of into a government that is proposing Nazi-type solutions. I don't think it is. I don't think we've gone that far. I think, on the other hand, the current bigotry which is encouraged by the government and the language of bigotry which we saw at the beginning of the 2000s has now been adopted by government ministers, the language of invasion, adopted by our current Home Secretary, appalling behaviour. It's not the persecution of Jews which is the issue. It's the attitude of people here. So yes, Lineker is absolutely right. The attitude of people here today in the early 2000s is very similar to the attitude of people in Britain in the run-up to the Second World War and during the Second World War. There's a book called An Age of Genocide, which by Kushner and Cox, and it says, I'm going to quote, of all the groups in the 20th century, refugees from Nazism are now widely and popularly perceived as genuine, but at the time, German, Austrian and Czechoslovakian Jews were treated with ambivalence and outright hostility as well as sympathy. People feel that the country should maintain asylum for genuine asylum seekers, but they've always in the past, they've always said this in the past, never today. The bigotry that we see today parallels the bigotry in the 1930s. And there's another book, Whitehall and the Jews, 1933 to 1948, by Louise London. And she says that the government process during the 1930s was designed to keep out large numbers of European Jews, perhaps 10 times as many as they let in. Around 70,000 had been admitted by the outbreak of the war, but the British Jewish associations had some 500,000 cases on their files of people who had been denied access and asylum here. Well, of course, after Kristallnacht, the the asylum process for people trying to get into the UK, trying to flee the Nazi persecution, got a little bit better by 1938. And when more than 1,000 synagogues were burned down, London changed the idea. But and I quote again Louise London: the myth was born that Britain did all it could for the Jews between 1933 and 1945. This comfortable view has proved remarkably durable, and is still adduced to support claims that Britain has always admitted refugees, and that the latest harsh measures against asylum seekers are merely designed to exclude bogus applicants. We remember the touching photographs and newsreel footage of unaccompanied Jewish children arriving on the Kinder transports. There are no such photographs of the Jewish parents left behind in Nazi Germany. The Jews excluded from entry to the United Kingdom are not part of the British experience because Britain never saw them. Memories of the unsuccessful public campaign to persuade the government to rescue Jews from mass murder faded quickly. And in many cases, the only reason Jewish people were admitted into this country were because the Jewish community here guaranteed to pay the expenses. And in other places, Canada, Australia, South Africa, and the USA were similarly blinkered to the problem, and they had a quota, exactly the same thing that Rishi Sunak wants to introduce into Britain, a quota. So again, many German Jews were unable to get out of the country because they didn't, because there were too many for the quota system. And Britain's post-war record wasn't actually much better. Although we saw a large number of refugees arriving shortly after the Second World War, very few were actually Holocaust survivors. And Britain's post-war immigration policy actually excluded Jews, non-white immigrants. And we're rapidly moving into an era that mimics, imitates, and uses the language of the racism of the 1930s and early 1940s. There's a cabinet minister in 1945 who said, "The admission of a further batch of refugees, many of whom would be Jews, might provoke strong reactions from certain sections of public opinion. There was a real risk of a wave of anti-Semitic feeling in this country." It's ironic, isn't it? In order to avoid anti-Semitism, you have laws which stop the migration of Jewish victims. Yet at the same time, there was no reluctance to admit entire groups of the Waffen-SS. It's quite bizarre the way our government has responded. So Lineker is quite right that there are parallels to the 1930s and 1940s. I think he's wrong in suggesting for 1 minute that the British government is paralleling the government of Nazi Germany. What he's right in is that Britain's government today is paralleling the British government of the 1930s and 1940s. And that is nothing to sing and dance about.